Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyson Bankert. I'll be moderating a panel we're entitling Building Anti-Racist Programs and Services. I have a panel of really great folks here to be able to speak to what that can look like today. I'm looking forward to our conversation that we'll be having uh, and digging into what does it mean to build anti-racist programs and services. And so with me today, I have Ikem Opura, Director of National Learning Partnerships with Redeal Hall Foundation, Chiquita Thompson-Reed, Senior Director of Equity at AVA's Initiatives for Homeless Youth, Jean-Claude Mundiaz-Amu, Executive Director of Umoja Community Mosaic, and Daniel Fraser, Program Innovation Lead at Brown Baking for Calgary for Kids. I work with several different hats, but today I'll be wearing my hat with Leadership Alliance Council, which is here located on Treaty 7, which is also here in Calgary. So I'll allow for each panelist to sort of introduce themselves a little bit more. But my first question I have for folks is, what does it mean for each of you to be accountable to anti-racism in the work that you do? Allowing for maybe just a very short, brief answer about what that means for you as before we get into the questions. So, what does it mean for each of you to be accountable to anti-racism? And only because they're on my left of my screen here, Chiquita, would you mind starting us off?
Hi, everyone. Greetings. My name is Shaquita Thompson-Reed, she, her pronouns. And for me, when I think of who am I accountable to in this work, I think of the community that has come before me. I think of my elders, my ancestors, my community. And so when I'm doing this work, it's not in a vacuum, but it's actually part of a long histories, and their stories that have come before me. So I say thank you. I hail to you from Treaty 13, Toronto. Thanks.
Thank you. John, how about you go?
When I do this work, I'm accountable to the people who live in the disrupted community.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so disrupted community. This is what systemic racism does. It's alienate people, and my job is trying to make those people feel that they belong to larger community. So I'm accountable to them.
Thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Danielle. Welcome. I'm an equity based design practitioner. My work involves supporting mainly nonprofits and public sector agencies and incorporating equity principles into their design processes. But to answer your question, um, which is a really good one, which is a really great one, when engaging with in anti-racism, especially as someone who is racialized, it's hard not to see yourself in the work. Um, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing. But being accountable to anti-racism to me is being accountable to myself, my son, my family, our community. And that's truly what grounds me in this work.
Thanks so much. And Ekem, how about you?
Hi everyone, my name is Ikam Opara, and I think there's a lot that my colleagues here on this panel have said that really resonate with me. The thing that keeps coming out to me is taking the work personally, and taking it personally in all of the connotations of what it means to take something personally, not just because of the skin that I'm navigating through this world, and it is also because I think anti-racism work done properly is a call to everyone to take the work seriously. So it doesn't just belong to any one community. It doesn't belong to any one sector or one part of society. We all have a role to play in getting us to this point. And we all have a role to play in getting us to a better place. So I think that accountability for me starts from the personal and extends outwards, in a very generational way, thinking about how the decisions and the things that I choose to preference in my work today impacts 7 generations down the road. So that's the way I see this work.
Thank you, everyone, for those brief introductions. And what I hear about is this work really is, and being accountable is being principled to the work. And so appreciate that. We're going to go into we have a few different questions for folks. As you all know, each of you will be asked a question, and then we can have a bit of a conversation between us about what comes up from that, and then we'll move on to the next one. So my first question is to Danielle, and thinking about even what it means to be principled and accountable. What is the difference between DEI and anti-racism when it comes to programs and service design? What's been your experience about that that difference?
I'm so excited to answer this question. So I'm just going to jump right in. I view equity as an overarching principle, right? And with that, we can add in the additional acronyms that you mentioned, Tyson. So there's diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And so again, those are all principles or foundations of how something should be. And then when you have anti-racism, which is a framework, and like other equity frameworks, they typically include tools, practices, strategies, and ways of doing that help us either work towards or live within those equity principles. Mm-hmm. So imagine, for instance, and please join me for this ride that I'm going to take you on. We're designing a program.
Holding on.
And let's say that we've done our due diligence already, and we've collaboratively established need alongside the community. From there, as designers, we'll usually go or typically start with our logic models, and then starting by defining our goals, our objectives, our audience, etc. And at the onset, that offers us a perfect opportunity to start right there at our goals and objectives and begin to look at how this imaginary program could or would work to address racism or work towards reducing racial disparities. And again, along for the ride, we have our imaginary columns, and we're looking at how we can apply anti-racism, our anti-racist lens to our outputs, our activities, our inputs, as well, our outcomes, and our lasting impact. So for example, if we start at an inputs column, we're always going to look at our budget and how and where our source of funding is coming from. Again, another good opportunity to reflect on where the funding is coming from and whether the funding creates barriers for our intended audience. Then we might want to look at staff, our staff folks, or the people who are going to be managing and implementing this imaginary program. Are they people with are they peers with lived experience? And then maybe we typically in this input column, we'll do staff capacity trainings, and are those learning opportunities focused on anti-racism or equity? And then what am I missing? Oh, lastly, partnerships. We always want to align ourselves with organizations, agencies, or even influencers nowadays, right? That really share our values of equity and anti-racism. And then using that same level of checks and balances across, our imaginary logic model.
That's great. I think, and I as I hear you, I'm imagining, with that sort of, when we think of design, think of anti-racism being embedded throughout that DEI process, which I think, to your point, to kind of the question that so often it is, you can't have one without the other. But I also feel like how important it is to capture that anti-racism component to, I think, a lot of the sort of the buzzword around DEI and what that means and looks like, and you can't really do DEI without anti-racism. And I'm wondering for folks, any other thoughts or comments from your experience about sort of that difference, or how you manage to incorporate that into the work that you do, or have had challenges trying to maybe convey the importance of it?
For me, I think something that I'm always considering in any program design is where the power imbalances lie, right? Oftentimes, especially when we're looking at systems and systems of oppression, oftentimes the folks who are most impacted by programs are not the architects of the program designs and models. And so, for example, at EVAS, we have a housing program specifically for Black youth, 65 rental supplements. And when we're looking at housing, oftentimes, as much as we're doing the work with and by and for and in support, where the opportunities where young people can come to us and say that actually we want to shift your program model and design. Even though you've already written this beautifully crafted grant that says these specific outcomes, actually I want to shift that, topple that. And where in our programs do we allow for the folks who are most impacted really have a say, autonomy, and self-determination as part of that embedded practice. And so oftentimes our systems are rooted in whiteness, and so how are we unpacking white supremacy in our systems and our structures?
Thanks so much. Yeah, that accountability piece. Who are we accountable to? And helping them shift that. Anyone else?
Yeah, for us, our program is built from grassroots, where basically we talk to people what people need. Because we understand that racism is not it's not something that happened by accident. Well, as a society, we designed it, and it was said to alienate people and divide people. So this is why we have something we call systemic liberation as an anti-racism, where there is community ownership, but not only Black community. Yes, we are Black red. However, where there is collective for rest of the community to benefit. However, the work has to be done by and designed on the grassroots level. And this is how we do it, where everybody contributes. 6 years old, it starts just on the playground, grown up to volunteer, they become staff, they become people who advocate for how they think programs should look like.
I think if I could add something here, Tyson, I think one of the things that comes up to me when I think of that difference is how the program and service gets designed. A bit to Shukita's point, I think DEI to me almost now starts to feel like the entry point into your design. I don't know where I learned this a while ago, that when you're talking about DEI, diversity is table stakes, it's taxonomy. That's you're counting what's there. When you now start to get more intentional and sophisticated and challenging systems and patterns and structures, then we start to talk about equity and inclusion and justice. But when you now roll all that together and are to like forcing the framework of the design journey that Danielle took us on, when you're now doing it intentionally with other people, that's when I think an anti-racism lens starts to enter into the conversation. You can do some of the things that live in DEI by yourself within your organization, some, not all, but it's difficult to push further into what it means to be anti-racist intentionally, successfully, and relentlessly without engaging a larger audience. And this might mean engaging an audience that might be quite resistant to it, that might be quite opposed to the way you're doing things, or to the fact that you're suggesting that they ought to be done at all. But I think that's where the magic is in that program and service design, when you have both the humility and the trust in the resilience of what you're designing to throw the design out the window when the community you're accountable to comes and says, this ain't it. And I think that's the challenging part, more challenging.
So thank you, Ikem. I'm curious though about this tension then that I often see maybe within our sectors, within nonprofit spaces, where you might find that you've and kind of speaking to folks here who are part of a DEI committee, or who have now in the last 2 years actually started to begin building at least a group of folks to kind of dedicate themselves to DEI structures. And someone raises their hand and starts to prompt some of the things that we're bringing up. What would we say to folks who are in that challenge around then having to also, and I think part of it is that it's always that, and also embed anti-racism. To Daniel's point, that should be also the start of where you of the process, but just to folks who are maybe who have been involved in those kinds of in those committees, what would we say to them who are maybe kind of stuck at that tension point where it does feel like a challenge, or trying to and because we do live in a white supremacist culture, having to really begin embedding that anti-racism components?
If I can, and I'll start. I think
Yeah.
it goes back to your previous question, Tyson, is what it means to be accountable. When you pass that conversation, that initiative, that activity, that social media post through that filter of how it interfaces with the community and the sort of the spirit that you're accountable to, if it doesn't make the cut, then you're not doing anti-racism work. You might be eventually, you might be getting there, but that starts to show you what the delta is, like what work you need to do to get to where you want to be. It's not necessarily like it's not good or bad. It might just be, this is the distance we've got to cover individually, as a group, as an organization, as a program in design, to get to the place we want to be.
I also think, thank you. I think that's really important. I also think it's so important for folks to know their social location of how they're getting to this work. Because if you're not able to socially locate yourself, then oftentimes you're impacting folks in ways that either are conscious or unconscious, but the impact is still the same. And also having a framework or an analysis where it allows you humility and the ability to say, I messed up. We didn't get it right. I think sometimes in white supremacist cultures, oftentimes we run this risk of perfectionism, right? So in order to be perfect, it means that we can't admit where we've made mistakes or we haven't brought community along, right? And so that when you're talking about that tension, I think oftentimes it's the humility to say, we actually didn't get it right and we need to start from scratch again. And it's in that learning and unlearning process where change oftentimes happens and can really yield you different, more meaningful results in relationships.
One more point I would make is anytime when we practicing anti-racism, we have to understand that we're introducing a new habit, So, and introducing new habit is not something you're gonna get it right away. It's something people have to practice. Just consistent, and also being able to admit, as long as you know where you're going, as long as you understand this is new habit you're introducing, I think the system will forgive you, and people you work with will understand. It's basically changing from all the habit to new habit. As I say, racism was designed. It's a set of patterns and habit. Anti-racism also have to have this. We call it a systemic liberation, which is introducing this new habit. And there will be resistance. There will be questioning yourself. Okay. However, there is always understanding that might not get it at the first when you try. However, giving up, that's what, or going back because this one is not working. This is what we need to fight always.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone's sentiment around this idea that it is, it's like a muscle. You have to work at it, right? And I think oftentimes when we think about, and when we make mistakes, which we all do, within the relationships that we hold, it is back to that question of who are we accountable to, and are we willing to be open to, within relationship and reciprocity, to really engage again and try something new, or listen and learn and from that as part of that process. My next question, I'll just go to Ekem here, is relationships are really vital to the work, I think, to what we've talked about around anti-racism, and why is it important to, I think, not just maybe embed relationships, but also take time and to nurture relationships in the work, in this work of anti-racism?
Oh, I think relationships, like you said, are critical. We can't do any of this work alone. Um, and in order to make sure that we can sustain the work and sustain ourselves in doing the work, and to learn from different perspectives, the relationships that you build and the ones you preference and nurture are critical. They will evolve over time. What you bring to those relationships will obviously be dependent on what you're hoping to get out of them, what energy you have in the moment, and what you're trying to do together, right? I think the reason it's important to embed into the process for me is that that's what prevents the work from falling apart quite quickly when things start to get difficult. It allows us to earn and build trust, which is the foundation for a lot of the work that we're trying to do to go far. When, like you said, mistakes happen, when design falls apart, when that community comes and says, like, this is not what we wanted you to do, if you have a good enough relationship with them, you're better, probably, first of all, you'll be in a better position to that you will be in a better position that they will actually feel comfortable bringing that kind of feedback to you and challenging your design in that way, in a supportive manner. And in reciprocating that, you will be better able to receive that and internalize it for what it is as an improvement. In the field of social cohesion and building community, one of the things that we talk about a lot about how you measure the cohesiveness of a community and the sense of belonging that someone has within a community is how comfortable they feel criticizing in order to improve.
Yeah.
And how comfortable that community is in receiving that criticism in order to improve. The lubricant there is those relationships. And if those relationships are not strong, intentional, and are being fed, it all sort of falls apart. Those relationships, building them needs to be properly resourced with time, money, space, forgiveness for them to ebb and flow. And I think in the most successful instances of this work that I've seen is where those relationships have had the space to actually fully develop before you start doing your first session, before you start doing your first thing that is typically the part where we start to measure. Now, I think we're getting to a place in some of our work where measuring those relationships in ways that don't jeopardize them has started to happen, and started to happen in meaningful ways, where there is value being placed in how many relationships, how strong they are, how many nodes there are in your network, who are in those nodes, and what you bring to them. But I think it definitely goes without saying that relationships are not just having them, but the process of building them, valuing them, evaluating them is important to our success.
Awesome. Danielle, I know that you were about to go before I had introduced the next question. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about what Ikam has brought up about relationships.
Oh, I would love to echo specifically the piece around trust, right? To put it quite plainly, this is community-based work. And what is a community without thriving relationships, right? Trust is a huge one, because in my experience, it's really hard to generate impact without it. Anti-racism work is so deeply informed by lived experience. And in order for you or anyone to share their lived experience, you need to feel safe, valued, heard. And then there's also a piece around trust in how we cultivate allyship and advocates amongst people who do not have the same lived experience as us. Yeah.
Great. I'm wondering a little bit about, what does it look like? I know for me, for example, when I bring folks together, when we want to talk about anti-racism work at that community level, it's often really also about acknowledging that we want to have, as a bullet line in the budget, right? Of saying we actually want to put money towards these specific things, and that I think oftentimes we will have we need these specific people to be in the room in order to have that conversation, and yes, it's about building trust and those relationships. So that intentional piece about really being, what does it look like to tangibly at the level to prioritize those relationships? What are some of those other ways in which we embed that into the work, into the way that we design it? And for me, I think it often comes down to even like the budget of like, this is a priority and we're going to put X amount of funds to this, and also acknowledging that harm can be caused. So we also want to make sure that when we're also being able to put money towards when people, when we talk about this work, it can be difficult, it can be hard. And so putting funds to that as well as being a really important piece. But I'm curious to know if anyone else has any of those kind of experiences as you prioritize relationships when it comes to the way you operate.
I can, for us, our organization is based on two things: trust and relationship. Because those two things, without it, you cannot build the community. Danielle spoke about it. In order to gain trust, you have to earn it. People have to, basically, you have to be vulnerable with people. This is why I'm always nervous to speaking in front of Black people, because there is wisdom that within the Black community where we come from, and which is there is indigenous knowledge now acknowledged, but there's also Black knowledge where community is built by that two things: trust and relationship. This is how people live in the village. So it's always financial gymnastic when you're trying to fund that relationship and the trust, because there's no funder who is going to fund something like that. And yet we can agree here, without those things, basically you are another bureaucrat. So to me, the way I try to do it, it's you rely on volunteers, and that community come. However, should not be that way, because everybody benefit and the system benefit, neighborhood benefit. Those two things should be the funders should find a way to evaluate those things and fund those things as well. However, for us, we try to do it as what I say, Black knowledge, where basically you can bring people together.
Thank you. Just for a second, I was kind of mentioning about money and dedicating that, and what I've called it, and you can look it up for those who are interested, a radical care fund as maybe a budget item when it comes to certain things. But please go ahead.
No, I was also going to add the piece around oftentimes our relationships are based in transactions. And so when we move from like transactional relationship to more relational pieces, how does that not only often feed into like one direction of how we mine or take information from community, but also how we're holding larger institutions or spaces accountable to be able to say, we value these relationships. And what does that mean so that you are funding it appropriately to be able to, for us to do this work in a different way? And why I started with shifting from transactional relationships, because many of our funding models are dependent on these tension points, right? I need to see a monetarily valued way of how your outcomes for programs will look like, but what does the cost of that mean for relationship building? How do we repair relationship, especially if we've harmed relationships in communities? Right? And how sometimes in our program designs, we are conduits of continuing to facilitate that harm, right? And so I think about when relationships are happening, what are also the radical conversations that sometimes we're needing to have internally, right? Because I think when I think of programs, I don't think of programs independently of organizations and the work that organizations need to do, because maybe they have one program that's doing the work, but how is that organization also upholding those standards to be able to facilitate that shift that we're looking for. So I'm thinking about all of those pieces, and then what is the power dynamic that we then have to introduce with different funders to be able to say our budget will look different because we're valuing these priorities. And that means that you may not see the same types of outcome measures in the same way because we're valuing relationship building, and these are the different ways that may be cultivated. So I'm thinking about all of those things that you're saying and sharing.
I will say that from my perspective, this is the part of the work that really, this is one of the parts of work that really does get me exciting, is when we can start to push at the established definitions of how it is that we engage with one another. Relationships are not just projects to community; they're also projects to funder, across funders, across projects. So that feedback and that the disagreement, disagreeing without being disagreeable. I think that is the term. Sometimes it's okay to be disagreeable; it can be necessary. But being able to say that this budget, this line item is not going to get you the outcome that you're hoping to get in this funding initiative, is a really exciting space for me as a funder to get into with a funding partner. I've been in there's an example of a funding relationship that I was connected to where we had a community member kind of pull out something really interesting about a bunch of projects that we were supporting, that on the one hand, we're driving at, and this was ages ago, this is not at my current employer. It was a situation where we're funding a number of projects that are driving up physical activity all over the place. And people are taking their families and the children and all these people to go and play sports, and there's lots of driving involved. And on the other hand, we're funding a lot of projects that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Same organization, different outcomes, but those two good outcomes, the activities that are getting us there, are in conflict with one another at a macro scale. That's kind of what I'm hearing from what you're saying, Shakita, is that there might be something in the way the funding is happening and that relationship is being built, that yes, the funds are there for you to go and create 1, 2, 3, 4 outcomes and outputs in the project, but the process by which you are required to do it actually cuts down any relationship that you need to build to be able to have those outcomes be, created in a dignified manner, in a way that's going to be sustainable, and such that the community does not feel taken advantage of in the process.
Love that. I'm just thinking of groups that, they may not necessarily serve only white folks or clients, but I think about when I say the word white serving organizations, I think about the big organization. Think about whatever issues that that are plague us in our society, right? And there's always there's an organization that sort of holds that. It's what most common folks might think of. Oh yeah, they tackle this, they tackle that, and they have maybe the most funding, they have the most prominence, they have the most impact. But then there's all of these usually subgroups, grassroots organizations who are doing the work maybe for their community or in a different way, in a different process. And those groups come and say, we don't have the same, we need more diversity, we need more inclusion. And I kind of always I get kind of prickly when I hear that sometimes, because I think about, well, where are your relationships? How are you maybe building new relationships with I could name you, even where I live, several different groups who are maybe tackling, for example, domestic violence, for example. And yet there's maybe one or two that most people know and think about. And they have the most sort of impact and sway. So I'm just wondering for folks, any thoughts about, and I've heard a lot about, I really like where this conversation is going on, where should those groups be considering, those white serving organizations, I guess, thinking about their relationships when it comes to anti-racism?
I can start because I think I live where you live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not far from each other.
It's very interesting here in Calgary. Many years ago, I used to think that it's happened for international organizations. However, I find that a charities model is it's paternalistic, and both international and local community development. So we have something called transformational charity, okay, where the basically transformation charity fosters a cross relationship among donors, partners, volunteers, participants, but does not derogate community ownership. Okay, so strategy and the direction must set by community itself. However, what you're talking about, so I started this work 14 years ago. I can count 7 white organizations wanted to hire me and take over this organization because they like my impact in the community, they like outcome. They come, some point they come and set up similar program beside me, same day, hoping because they have snacks and everything, children are just going to cross the street and come to them. Okay.
Right.
And did not happen. Yeah, we're going through that again. So, and yet we still today have those organizations basically have money to do what we do, but they can't do it because they don't know how to do it. There's no participation. And rather than actually saying, okay, we have these resources, we going toward the same goal, okay, how can you partner? So partnership here in Calgary is takeover. And sometimes it's very annoying when funders are actually pushing you to go to work with it. Those organizations you have nothing in common with. However, I do believe some foundation here changing, which is very encouraging. However, we have a way to go there. Unless those organizations are come willing to see what small organization grassroots are offering. Okay, I don't think we basically there's work of anti-racism going somewhere. There are other organizations. What they do is hiring Black people, and when they deal with me, they're gonna send frontline person to come and talk to me. Is not a CEO of organization who gonna come and talk to executive organization, and that's a problem. And
I appreciate that the comment about, and this is really comes back to what Shakuda, you were saying about that transaction. It's all very transactional. We operate in this very transactional way of being like and thinking of this is what will get us the relationships that we think we might need. And I'm wondering for you, and we were in 2 years ago, and I think in the exact same sort of conversation around design and embedding anti-racism. And so I'm wondering for you, like, what has changed in the last years from your experience, or what have you been seeing that's maybe more challenging? Because I think, as we've talked about, anti-racism is an ongoing process, and yet, Jean just said 14 years ago, he had an incident of people trying to sort of maybe take the clients or whatnot, and the children to their project, but then he's still being confronted with that same type of transactional type of relationship. So I'm wondering for you, what is some things that maybe have ongoing that's been happening are shifting, or maybe not shifting?
A couple of things for me that, like, when I think of the last 2.5, 3 years, I think of we've gone through a global pandemic, right? And so it's actually shifted the way in which we've even thought about hybrid workspaces and cultivating designs. I think in that space of time, huge organizations, or even how we gather together, has shifted and shape shifted in that time. But I think of when it comes to anti-racism work, folks are oftentimes like, well, we can't do it. But we've rebuilt our whole organizational structures so that we can all facilitate hybrid conversation, go hybrid. And when it comes to talking about racial justice, inequities, oftentimes these same barriers or blockage around how how we can't support or build long-term sustainable funding often comes up as roadblocks. And so 2 years later, when you ask me, what have I seen different? I think about the demonstrations and the declarations that we saw out of 2020, 2021. And I think about what are the conditions of well-being that have changed for different groups of people 2 years later from that as a result of that. Right. I think of when oftentimes DEI efforts get us to the starting point of conversations. But when I think of sustained change, what does it mean for capital investments? What does it mean for reducing how poverty impacts Black communities across the country? Right. I work in the homeless field. And so those are some of the questions that I'm asking. Is it yielding us the result through our anti-racism practices that we're looking to gain for conditions of well-being and support? And so things that I'm still seeing is how white supremacy culture permeates even our spaces. And so it's so embedded into even our thinking and our designs that it causes us to have to constantly unpack it. So those are some questions that we're still checking even within ourselves, right? Because we are not immune to the systems and legacies of colonialism in which we inherit and continue to perpetuate in different ways. So how are we constantly having that conversation of reconciliation or reconciling and acknowledging that truth?
Love that. Anyone else have any questions that they've been pondering over the last little while, where there's like, what, has it changed? Has it not changed? What are some of those challenges that you're seeing that you want to, when as we think about who's listening today, and maybe that they can really feel maybe a bit more inspired from, or question that their own organization's impact?
Yeah, I would love to speak to this. Just listening to my peers speak in this space, I think in my experience, what is the popular opinion or the popular conversation is having like EDI or DEI live within this human resources space. And kind of that's like all that it is and all that it could be applied to. And I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation today, because I think one of the challenges in doing this work is teaching folks how it's a part of the design. It's the design process, right? It's going back to what John was saying about making it a habit. That's where we start. That's where we start the work, is applying equity principles to every single design process, because it can be applied to each design process.
I like that.
I like that. I like the notion of forcing that design, this ethic right through all of the design process and all of the work. To your point about DEI work living in HR, I understand in terms of the streamlined, like drawing an org chart that's streamlined. Yes, makes sense. Put it there. But I think when you actually start to look at the functions, what DEI in its best interpretation can do in an organization, it's got to be cross-cutting. It has to go laterally and vertically across the structures in your organization, and that does not allow it to live fully inside one department. It has to be a part of everything that you do. And so, one of the things that I have seen over the last 2 years is this uptick in the engagement of, experts and educators from particular communities to come and talk about issues that have to do with equity and inclusion. I'm not seeing that same change I'm not seeing a lot more organizations and companies with Black-led legal firms or Black-led accountancy firms or Black-led real estate agencies. So that there's a pattern, a potential pattern, maybe, or a signal of reaching to a particular community when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, because that's something that this community seems to be very interested in. And there's a sense that if the person who comes to talk about it comes from this community, that checks up the box. That means we have considered and engaged all of our biases. I had a colleague who was doing a lot of phenomenal work in the organization where I was working with them at. This person happened to be an Indigenous person and was running a lot of the Indigenous programs that we worked on. On probably a couple of years into the gig, having a conversation with them, it was like, I actually really wanted to work with Black youth when I came to this organization. This is an interest of mine. This is something I'm really good at. I have a lot of experience of it, but I'm also Indigenous, and so ended up running the Indigenous program. So there is some of that, questioning of how we actually design with intent, as opposed to allowing things to more than often fallen into patterns, because that's just where natural fit seems to be at that moment.
The word that kind of comes to my mind is tokenism, in the way that in which we often think about if and I appreciate, Danielle, what you're saying about DEI being something that's sort of a part of the HR department, right? And so often I think that has been maybe a shift where people have, we need more diversity, and so therefore we need more it's hiring practices, and yet what I'm hearing also is that obviously isn't enough, but it also then lends itself to, you've hired the person, they have come into your organization, but the anti-racism or efforts or the DEI efforts have only been very stagnant to the HR department, when really what I'm hearing is all the other departments have to also be shifting in that direction, not just more diversity, but thinking about really embedding it. And so I'm wondering also if there's any additional thoughts about how that conflict continues to arise, and what that does to maybe individuals within those organizations when we don't have those design shifts over all aspects of a space.
Sorry. What I'm going to say is super short, but I think what comes up for me is unsustainability, performative actions, harm, because when we do things without intention, harm naturally occurs.
Yeah.
I also think about sometimes there's this polarization that happens when things live just within an HR context, right? Because sometimes the traditional functions of HR, it sometimes is about protecting the organization's interest, and sometimes what comes up when it's the organizational interest is separate and different from the experiences of employees and systems, right? And what is the accountability measures for equitable change and outcomes to happen? And so oftentimes, if it's just living in one particular context, it doesn't allow for this overarching shift to happen in outcome measures, in not just hiring people, but what are the skills, the tools you're equipping people with, and shifting and changing the culture of the environment, right? So it's not enough to just hire enough Black people and say that we've done it, but what is the environment that folks are coming into and being a part of? And that's a lot of work that it takes to learn and unlearn, but also untangle how that shows up. And so we've seen the rise of that in the last 2 years, but also how do we pick it apart and actually have outcomes to measure it by?
I'm going to shift the next question to Jean. You've mentioned this a couple of times about systemic racism to systemic liberation, and I think you've also highlighted how we live in the charity sector, nonprofit sector. Really, I think can be a really toxic container for those shifts, right? And so I'm wondering for you, and is like, what has those shifts felt like for you, going from being able to sort of acknowledge that systemic liberation within the organization that you run, and how have you had to bump up against like that because of that, within the charity sector?
Uh, when I came, I didn't come from university with a lot of research. I came from someone who lived in disrupted community in Africa and come here and find that the problem that people have in refugee camp, this disconnection exists here in inner city of Calgary, where young people have they don't share language, they don't share games, they don't share anything, and yet there were thousands of charity organization that working in this public housing. I was so social breakdown. So the first question was, who do you think you are? Okay, so then second is it can't be done, okay, because there is a B C D, okay, and I was frustrated because I was in the meeting where there was demanding more money. This organization, which is my children, came many times to these programs. When I come there, I find that kids are eating snacks. They're running around was more harm than doing any good for children. So I say, okay, outside, it was not safe. The kids were doing what they do when they have nothing to do. So then there was two choices. Either I lock my kids in the house or I'm going to make this neighborhood safe. So the concept of making neighborhood safe was something, a new concept. So what I did, I introduced a soccer in this green space. The kids loved it. Then next, I went to get volunteers. Now I ran into issue of you have to have insurance, okay? But the parent came to volunteer, parent of these children, okay? So then going on, I did not get funding or anything for probably 6 years. Then we become charity because everyone said, okay, you become a charity. So I got the board, I put board together of those volunteers, those stay-at-home moms who live in this public housing, and professional people who came to know these children, who saw progression of impact. Shoplifting stopped in the neighborhood, the businesses got involved. Then now we got charity. So now was we don't believe you can do it. You don't have capacity. So if you don't help me, how can I get capacity? We know, right. We have outcome. School recognize that. We have at this moment 100% high school graduation rate. So anyone in those big organizations would go to funders and tell them, no, that's a grassroots. It's just gonna die like any other grassroots. Basically, there was zero level of taking risk on us. They take risk of anything, but not taking risk of this black-led organization. So we not having funding, it gave me freedom to do what I wanted, what I think was right. Working with the communities, we design to the point, thanks to pandemic, everyone locked down and the organization grew. So from one location to everywhere in the corner of Calgary. Today, everybody's chasing what we are doing. They're trying to imitate what we do. System they used during COVID, we are the one who designed it. Door-to-door delivery, giving laptop to children because of connection we had in the community. We knew what was issue. So until today, with the funders, the pushback was, we want you to work with this organization. We say no, okay? Because we think we are doing very well, you agree, we can do it. So basically, still we have to prove, okay? I have 12 full-time staff. Some, they have master degrees, they can do everything I cannot be able to do. However, still, okay? Some organizations still, I'm still bumping to that, saying, okay, I have someone who never found me even one day, asking me succession plan. Okay, I say, we haven't even get anywhere near.
Right.
So anyway, we still have that hurdle because, again, of people don't understand the collective healing through community ownership, where rather than actually bringing people to give them something, You empower people to make decision, to serve, to host, not to be hosted. Okay, this is a new concept, and also we opened the door for so many Black organizations now are being born in this city. Very few who didn't work with me coming and see how we do it. Be brave, but we're still having that resistance. Now we have a program called incubation, where we're bringing someone and work with us, shadow us in what we are doing, telling them you don't need to partner with someone who is moving your vision because they are paying you a salary. Okay, because you're gonna get salary, but if you have no outcome, the trust in the community is going to go away. So community understanding this trust, this relation-based trust rather than transaction, no, is still the hurdle, and this is still something we're working on.
Thank you so much for those gems there, because I what I hear is how oftentimes the charity or nonprofit model, or the way that we are often white serving organizations, or however you want to frame them, are designed in a way that ultimately actually can start to erode the community aspects of what our intentions are when it comes to organizing, or when it comes to, and that idea of that systemic liberation, I think, is what I'm hearing you say, is like part of it is being able to have maybe distance and boundaries from, I think, the sector that we're in. And so but since we're in it, right, how do we have those conversations about, I'm curious for other folks, how do you keep those boundaries? How do you remain accountable, back to sort of that first question of just what does that look like to John really helped us sort of think about how do we handle and navigate that, and also inspire other people to do that, because that's also what I hear as well. So I'm just curious if anyone has any additional thoughts before we start to close here.
I think about systems of dependency that's created oftentimes as a result of charity models, right? Many of the spaces in the sector depends on people who are not having access to something, right? I'm in the homeless space.
Yeah.
It depends on young people not having access to housing. And so I say this knowing that I also am part of the same system, right? But what does that mean when we're looking at moving away from systems of dependency, which is rooted and anchored in scarcity model? Right? So it means that we actually have to do a paradigm shift to actually ask different questions. The entry point needs to look different so that we can get and yield different results. So liberation looks like access to opportunity within the Black community who can design the outcomes themselves. Right? It's not tethered or anchored to whiteness. It is starting from a place of centered in community, capital funding, all of the ways in which that community can work around what self-determination looks like in whatever outcome or field that folks are in. So those are some quick thoughts around how do we unpack the charity model.
I appreciate all of that. And I think about mutual aid models and things like this that have been popping up that, really fight the systems in a lot of ways. And I think, you can be in both if that, in a way, because you have to be able to do that. So I'm wondering from other folks if they have any comments about this dynamic that we're bringing up here.
Shakita used the exact word that I would use to describe the sector, and that is the scarcity mindset, which I think is partly due to our funding models that we talked about. It's extremely competitive, but if you allow me to be a dreamer for a second and speak and think about liberation, I think rather than this work being a project or an initiative, it would look like building it again, going back to building it into our structures, our ways of doing things, becoming a practice and a habit from the ground up, building equity from the ground up, rather than it kind of being like, oh, let's build it in.
If I come back to my point, is strategy and direction must be set by community itself. However, the charity and the government should come as support, okay? Not coming to impose as usual the way it's built, support.
Mhm.
And that's again, that's collective healing lead to systemic liberation. Again, new habit and culture, because we have a habit that was built and designed. So in order to remove that systemic racism, we need also to put the habit, and funders, I think they have a huge role to play because they need to allow this voice, especially they can see that when you come on the ground, it's working. When you talk about a space and in capital, project or investment, yes, that's something also can have a whole day topic about it
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
I do rent a space, okay, and it's always on the mercy of someone else.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. You can go ahead. You had chime in
I
there.
left up what everyone has already said. The things that I would add are that three quick things. This work is endless.
Yes.
So it is important to recognize that and know how to set up your own emotional, physical, psychological boundaries to define what your locus of control is, what you can influence, where your energy is starting to deplete, and you can reach out and reach up for support, for a shoulder, for someone or someone that is close to you to support through that organizationally and within whatever circles you're in. That also means that there is always an opportunity to do better than we did yesterday. And that's across the board, funders, government, community, all of this,
Mhm.
the partners in this work that we're talking about. I think we do sometimes have a tendency to silo those actors. But the reality is that, funders are also, my father would say, they put their pants on one leg at a time too. So there's the people, they're human beings. They're not immune to making mistakes. They're also not, you don't also let them off the hook for learning from those mistakes. That applies to every actor in this space. But I think to Jean-Claude's last point there, I think there is a need to continue to change that narrative that one group is the recipient of ideas and funding and support, and the other is the source of the ideas and funding and support. As funders don't have a role to play if there's nothing to fund. If there's no projects to invest in, there's no way for you to be a funder absent that. So at the same time, you want to make sure that you're doing it properly and you're learning from how you are doing it. The other thing is also the fact that I think one thing that comes up for me when I think about how we do anti-racism work in a holistic way is that some of this, it's not only about the struggle and the fight to change things for better. It's also sitting in the joy and the beauty of who we are and where we've come from and what we are today. That presence, taking up space and being as Black and as loudly and proudly Black as you are, is part of doing anti-racism work in all of the spaces that we're talking about. And that to me is how you start to stack up moments to build towards the kind of momentum that shifts these narratives closer to that idea of what systemic liberation can be when you lift it up from an individual to group and from an individual through group and community place. The last thing is we can't do this alone, and we can't do this only through certain identities. We can't have Black liberation and systemic liberation across the board when we are still figuring out how trans Black kids are part of this conversation, how they are part of this conversation within Black communities and a part of and in communities that are not Black. So the ways we challenge and lift up the intersections that exist in all of our identities and how those are confronted by racism and anti-racism work is an essential part of how we get to joy and how we get to justice as we do this work.
Any comments about what Kim has brought up, or anything you want to continue to champion?
I love the piece about having it has to be intersectional. It has to, like, there's no if, ands, and buts. But I love the piece about Black joy. I think when I think about this work, it also requires rest. The system will keep us tired because we are not resting, and it will keep us depleted intentionally. So I think of all of the movements that have burned out because we weren't able to look at it in the long haul and who's doing what collectively and coordinated in a way. So we can say, I can tap out and others can step in and fill as a community. And so I think about, yes, we may be in rooms independently, but how are we reaching across and working together and sharing and shifting models? And it has to be with other communities. It doesn't require just the Black community to solve racism. We didn't create racism, so we shouldn't only have to be the ones responsible for solving it. So I end there.
Danielle, do you have any comments, thoughts?
Oh, that rest piece. Like, how do we pour from an empty cup? We cannot. Rest is so important, and oftentimes it's something that we overlook. But when I think about rest and how I rest, it's by saying no respectfully. I've learned that not all work is good work. And I know for me, when I found myself in situations where I should have said no, that internal turmoil that follows me during the day, that goes home, that I think about at night, prevents me from sleeping. And that is the opposite of rest and peace. So where I would want to leave it, or my last note would be that I found so much peace in putting myself first sometimes. And I know in this work, it's like hard to do, but that's where I would leave it.
Thank you. Well, that was my last question, as you all know, is how do you find rest? So, so Danielle, you did, you brought up yours, which is really profound, about that ability to say no and knowing when to say no. And I'm wondering for other folks, what does that look like for you? Because I think what I've been really leaning into is the power of rest, the power of that I exist. My productivity has nothing to do with my actual existence. I can be who I am and do nothing and still have meaning and an existence that matters. And so I'm curious to know from other folks, what does that rest look like? Because this work is hard. I think coming into spaces that are that Black and not Black can be difficult to have to be part of the emotional load that takes to discuss these things, to be kind of always having to bump up against a charity sector, or to build relationships, or be the one who's leading the relationships. We talk about you mentioned the source, right? And so oftentimes the source is those funding models, but this is the process. You do A, you do B, you do C, and yet it's still, the onus oftentimes is on the folks who on the recipient end to keep that going.
Yeah.
And yet those who have the power to choose, maybe not this term or this year, but yet you still need to have those relationships there, and that takes a lot of effort and work. So I'm curious to know from the other three folks on the panel, what does rest look like for you as we wrap up? There's only a few minutes left.
For me, I will speak because we grassroots. When you talk about rest, is when you see the impact and when you see that you solve a problem, that's equal to the rest for us in community, because we don't have luxury of having core funding. That you can say, I'm going to take time off, or even sometimes networking is almost not existent because of you're solving a problem constantly, and some, if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So this is something also kind of it's very hidden. I've seen many very good people doing things and can't continue, and it is basically satisfaction that you solved that problem, because
Love that.
yes, that's equal to the rest for some of us here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Shakira, go ahead.
I find joy in rest in spending time with my Black babies and in the ground, anchored, in just spending time in the small moments, because I don't know they don't come often. And so that can look like rest, or a pause from the work, the hard, heavy work that is the emotional labor that we oftentimes carry in space. So rest for me is spending time with the kiddos and family and community, and anchored in those pieces. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hear you, Shaquita. I don't know. I have 6-year-old twin daughters. So if you asked me 7 years ago, I could tell you what rest was. But now I think I'm good with what replenishes me. And I think for my partner and I, it's just figuring out ways that we can engage in a meaningful way with, we be completely present with them when they're home. I think that is what is replenishing for us, for me. And the good thing is, because of the kind of work that I do, I can see them in my work, and I can see what I'm trying to contribute to in the outcomes of my work when I am successful, and the outcomes of my work when I am failing at it. And so that allows me to keep constantly connected to that thing that, refills my cup at the end of a long day or long conversation or a long meeting. And that's it for me.
Well, that is it for the panel, folks. Thank you, everyone, for participating, for your thoughts, for your emotions, for your intellect today. I really appreciate all of the nuance to these conversations. I don't think it's never easy, but it is also something that I think, as we begin to carve out spaces that each of you have in a way to challenge those systems, to embed and to raise them, not just for Black folks here, but for others as well. And that sense of community that we want to build, I think, is incredibly important. So thank you, everyone, for participating, and for those who are watching. I do hope that this was a meaningful conversation to be able to listen to and to learn from. And so thank you to each of you for being part of that, making it happen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.